Take a look at this quote from Mikhail Gorbachev to the United Nations in 1988, so 3 years after he has become the leader of the Soviet Union. Now, the words here, the vocabulary is quite dense, quite difficult to understand. Just focus on the two bits in bold there. Try and compare them to what Khrushchev or Brezhnev or Stalin would have said if they had been alive. Force, or the threat of force, should not be tools of foreign policy. The principle of freedom of choice is not negotiable. Refusal to recognise this principle will have serious consequences for world peace. To deny a nation choice, regardless of any excuse, is to upset the unstable balance that has been achieved. Freedom of choice is a universal principle. It knows no exception. Now, if you think back to a few lessons ago where we introduced to the Brezhnev doctrine, Brezhnev was saying entirely different things. He was warning that any deviation, any change from what he believed communism to be in Eastern Europe would result in an attack on all of Eastern Europe, at least according to him. In other words, the Brezhnev doctrine gave him the right to invade any Eastern European country if they changed communism from what he believed communism to believe. In comparison, Mikhail Gorbachev here is saying that actually any country can be any type of communist because any country has any right to be anything. Freedom of choice is a universal principle. It knows no exception. Doesn't matter if you're communist or democratic. If you want your country to change into another different type of country, that is absolutely fine, according to Gorbachev. Now that leads us on to a slightly odd question. It's one of the last questions we'll be asking in this Cold War course. How did the curtain bring down the wall? Which sounds like one of those awful riddles your uncle gives you at Christmas time. Obviously here we're talking about the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall. Now if you take a look at these vocabulary lists, hopefully you should be a little bit soothed compared to previous lessons, because most of the vocabulary here we've already gone over, either in recent lessons, or if you look at János Kadar there, something from 1956 and the Hungarian uprising. Still got a few more, such as Sinatra Doctrine and Nicolae Ceausescu, but we'll come on to them in a moment. We've looked at two previous strategies of Gorbachev to try and end the Cold War tensions and reform communism from within. So his first change was perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika to restructure the communist economy by allowing some capitalism, some private business, and glasnost to reform the political system by allowing some democracy and some freedom of speech. Last lesson we looked at how he, along with Reagan and Bush Sr., ended the arms race with the USA with things such as the START talks or the CFE treaty. This lesson we're going to look at how he deliberately ended Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Now that one in particular is going to have dramatic consequences far beyond what he would have possibly imagined. And I know we've said it before, but we need to say it again. In this period, Gorbachev is a committed communist. He's just like Alexander Dubček in Czechoslovakia. He believed that people needed to choose communism in order for it to work. He is still alive today, and now he is a Democrat. He doesn't believe in communism, or at least the main ideas of communism. But in this period, in the 1980s and early 90s, he believes that communism can still work in a European country. So we're going to go through many different dates over this lesson, and it's very easy to get bogged down in the details. I'm going to point out when things are particularly important. There will be a question in a separate video, which you should go back and look at this one to try and get an idea on what to write. But the collapse of Eastern European communism is messy. I've tried to keep it as chronological as possible, as time order as possible, but even in this PowerPoint, we're going to jump back 2 or 3 times. So apologies for the slightly messy lesson today, but this was an incredibly messy process. No one saw the collapse of communism coming, and no one saw the collapse of the Berlin Wall in particular. So, in 1988, Gorbachev abandoned the Brezhnev Doctrine in that speech which we just went through. He followed that up in the next year with a visit to East Germany, and he stressed that the USSR's army would not crush demonstrations like in Hungary or in Czechoslovakia. That's something which a Soviet leader hadn't promised before. After the Hungarian uprising of 1956, very few people wanted to take part in some sort of demonstration or uprising across Eastern Europe because they were worried that sort of thing would happen. And it did happen in Czechoslovakia, it happened in Poland, and it happened to a small extent in East Germany. Gorbachev makes it clear that he will not follow Brezhnev's direction, and he won't follow Khrushchev's direction either. This was followed up again in the 25th of October 1989 with his Sinatra Doctrine. Now, if you think about all of these doctrines, all of these policies or ideas across the course, they all are named after the person that created it. So Truman or Brezhnev or Carter. The Sinatra Doctrine is actually named after Frank Sinatra, Ask Your Grandparents. We've got a link here to the song which it refers to. I've never quite understood it because it kind of makes sense, but the idea is that in the song, Frank Sinatra is looking back at the end of his life and he's very happy because even though there were some pitfalls and there were some times where he was sad, it was good because he did it his way. He got to choose how he lived his life. So in this Sinatra Doctrine, Eastern European countries can do whatever they like as long as they do it my way. I mean, it kind of works if they're singing the song, just don't overthink it too much. Now, Gorbachev had announced the Sinatra Doctrine in 1989, but to be honest, he'd been doing this since he came to power in 1985, because between 1985 and 1989, there are no examples of him interfering in other Eastern European countries like Poland or East Germany or Hungary. And as we've seen before this is announced, he's specifically saying we won't interfere if you do something which we don't particularly approve of. After all, that is his basic idea of glasnost, isn't it? It's openness. If you're allowed to criticise the Soviet government, it stands to reason that you'd be allowed to not do what the Soviet government wanted you to do. So to see the importance of the Sinatra Doctrine, it would be good to compare it to two vastly different communist countries in the 1980s and 1990s. So we've got Hungary, who we've already seen, and Romania. So János Kadar had been the ruler of Hungary since 1956, and to begin with he'd been that cruel, repressive puppet leader from the Soviet Union who just did whatever Brezhnev or Khrushchev or others wanted him to. In the 1970s and 80s, he'd started to allow very minor reforms, and actually life in Hungary had gotten better because of it. In 1988, he was starting to become very poorly, and he was replaced. In fact, he died the year later. The new leader tried to promise further changes to prevent the unrest that was building across Hungary. In comparison, in Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu had ruled since 1965 with an iron fist. Romanians suffered under one of the harshest communist regimes. The use of oppressive police tactics had not gone away. The economy was in an absolute shambles in the 70s and 80s. And as a result, many Romanians demanded further change. But the Romanian government simply ignored them. In fact, even after the Berlin Wall fell, according to the Romanian government, it had not fallen, it was still there. So it's the kind of barefaced lies that people have just become accustomed to in a communist government. Going back to Hungary, the Hungarian Communist Party rebranded itself as the Socialist Party. Remember, we said that for our course, these two are basically the same type of thing, but the point here is that the Hungarians were trying to distance themselves from everything they had done before. This was in the build-up to the first truly free election since 1945, or arguably the first free election in Hungary ever, because the 1945 one had the use of salami tactics. In any case, the new Socialist Party came fourth, and the top three easily got over 50% of the votes. As a result, with relatively little bloodshed, Hungary became a truly democratic country. Jumping back to Romania, this was not the case. In the 16th of December 1989, there were violent riots in the city of Timișoara, the kind of second city of Romania. Over 100 people were killed in those days alone. Over 1,000 would be killed across the entire Romanian revolution. Over the next 5 days, Ceausescu and the communist government tried to maintain order, but by the 21st of December, it was clear that the people had had enough. Ceausescu and his wife were forced to flee in a helicopter, and the helicopter pilot, realizing that communism was overthrown, realized he didn't have to listen to Ceausescu anymore, and just landed in a field, told Ceausescu to get out of there. They flagged down a car who kind of locked them in a farm, and they are arrested by the new democratic government who kind of took control in their own coup. They were put on trial on the 24th of December and they were executed around 3 hours later. So not particularly democratic or full of clear justice, but Ceausescu was not a nice man, so I don't think anyone's going to massively mourn his passing. That same Democratic Party that took control in December won the genuinely free election in May 1990 as well. So you can see two very different countries both turning democratic. Either if the Communist Party accepted it, it tended to be quite bloodless. If the Communist Party refused it, it turned out, especially in Romania's case, to be particularly bloody. Now, going back to East Germany and the Berlin Wall. If you like, we have a clip here, it's around 5 minutes, which sums up why the wall was built in the intervening years between 1961 and 1989. One problem with East Germany was that, like Romania, it refused to accept perestroika and glasnost. They were worried that if these things were allowed to prosper, allowed to flourish in East Germany, then East Germans would demand change. Either way, East Germans demanded change. They couldn't stop East Germans from either visiting other places like Czechoslovakia or Hungary, or just reading about it or listening about it. Remember, by this point, computers are starting to be a thing. The world is becoming so much more connected, so it's much, much harder to deny reality than Stalin would have had to have done in the 1940s. Now, in 1987, one of the last things President Reagan does for our course is that he visited West Germany, and you can see that picture of him there in front of the Brandenburg Gate, kind of an iconic part of Berlin. It'd be the same as standing in front of like Tower Bridge or the House of Parliament in London. And he gave a very important speech, and you can see a link there. But the main point is he would say to Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And you can hear the tens of thousands of Germans who are massively applauding him for it. Now, if you think about it, that speech is actually completely inappropriate because Gorbachev has already washed his hands of East Europe. A couple of years later, in his Sinatra doctrine, he'll specifically say, I am not responsible for Eastern European countries. But in any case, the tone and the message of this still resonates. So this increases pressure both outside of East Germany and East Germany to tear down that wall. So looking at what's happening and why the Berlin Wall becomes irrelevant. So along with Hungary becoming democratic, it opened up its borders with Austria. You can see those coloured countries there to demonstrate the problem. All of the red ones and the purple Hungary had been behind the Iron Curtain, that thing that Churchill had warned about in 1946. The reason the Iron Curtain was so evil and so scary was that it prevented the free movement of people from east to west. That was the main reason the Berlin Wall had been built in the first place, because that was the gap in the Iron Curtain. Someone could travel from East Berlin into West Berlin and then just get on a train to West Germany or France or Britain. So with the Berlin Wall built, there was no gap in the Iron Curtain. May 1989, there was now, for the first time in over 3 decades, a place where someone could easily go from East Europe into West Europe. That means the Berlin Wall is basically irrelevant. So an East Berliner can just travel to Hungary, walk over the border into Austria, and then get a train up into West Germany as if he'd been able to walk over the street in the first place. Gorbachev visited East Germany in October 1989 just to reinforce his Sinatra doctrine. He also warned the leader of East Germany, Honecker, that the Soviet Union would not intervene. He would not be like Stalin with the Berlin blockade. He would not be like Khrushchev with the Berlin Wall. A few weeks later, there's the largest demonstration in East German history, with 1 million people marching on the streets. And bear in mind, that is roughly 1 in 2 people of East Berlin, or 1 in 4 people of East Germany at this point. A couple of days later, the East German government accidentally opened the border crossings. The link there gives a much better summary than I'd be able to give, but essentially one leading German or East Berlin official was on TV announcing that within a few days it would be easier to pass from East Berlin to West Berlin, but he accidentally announced, oh no, it's straight away, you can go right there, right now, and the border guards had to let these people in. So over the next few days, up to 1 million people were crossing the border to see relatives or life in the West. That's not the same as the brain drain with 1 million people leaving forever every single day. But the point is that gap has gone. The psychological barrier and the physical barrier has been removed. It's therefore no surprise that people were sick of the wall by this point. Remember, it's been 38 years since the Berlin Wall was built in 1961. We have another video here with David Hasselhoff with a light-up jacket singing his incredibly famous song. It's kind of like anti-Cold War anthem. He was a celebrity in the 1980s in Germany already, so no SpongeBob SquarePants just yet. By June 1990, the dismantling of the wall was officially started, though we can see from this picture it had been going on for many months beforehand. In October 1990, West and East Germany were officially reunified, and that day is now a national holiday in Germany, I believe. So, West Germany was a member of NATO. When East Germany and West Germany joined together, the new Germany was already a member of NATO. As a result, there's no longer any real reason for the Warsaw Pact to exist. Remember, West Germany joining NATO was the reason the Warsaw Pact was created. Khrushchev was worried about the West allying itself and trying to build up support for West Germany. But now that all of Germany is in NATO, and now that the Sinatra Doctrine has made it clear that one Warsaw Pact country won't invade another Warsaw Pact country, there was absolutely no reason for it to exist. So that happened in May 1991. By December 1991, the Soviet Union itself has collapsed into 15 different, essentially democratic countries. And we'll cover that in much more detail next lesson. So that is a whirlwind tour of how a curtain helped bring down a wall. So you'll probably want to go back through this or either look at the textbook links which I've put in the Schoology page. One final question I'd like you all to consider is that stretch and challenge. Which country played the largest role in the fall of the wall? The Soviet Union, Hungary, or East Germany? So to go through each of those in turn, obviously the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev in particular, has set up three key ideas: perestroika and glasnost, and the Sinatra Doctrine. Hungary created that gap in the Iron Curtain, essentially erasing the reason for the Berlin Wall to exist. And obviously East Germany has kind of a good and a bad. On the bad side, they resisted perestroika and glasnost for several years, unlike a place like Hungary. But on the good side, they did eventually get rid of the wall. They didn't mean to, but they absolutely did. So it's another type of question where there's no clear right answer. The important point, I think, is that none of those countries are Western. I haven't even bothered to include the USA. Reagan's tear down this wall speech is fantastic, it's iconic, it helped build support. But if you had another Brezhnev in power of the Soviet Union, it would not matter. If Hungary had not gotten rid of that gap in the Iron Curtain, created that gap in the Iron Curtain, it would not have mattered. And if East Germany had been stronger and able to crush that dissent, it would not have mattered. So the fall of the Berlin Wall is definitely not the responsibility or the reputation of the West. It seems to be problems in the East or changes from Eastern European leaders. So we have one more real lesson after this, ladies and gentlemen. We need to look at the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. In between those two videos, I'll have one shorter video looking at a question 2, an analytic narrative, which we haven't looked at yet. If you are using the team sessions this Wednesday or Thursday in mid-July, I would advise you skip that last video and watch the team session instead, and we can learn about it in real time.